Awesome. I think we can get started. So good afternoon and welcome to the Living with Wildfire webinar series. My name is Zoe Fung and I'm the Wildfire Conservation Coordinator with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. So the CCRCD is one of more than 90 RCDs across the state of California, and we facilitate the stewardship and conservation of the natural resources in Contra Costa County. So while wildfire is an inevitable phenomenon and can be a positive and regenerative force, we all know that catastrophic wildfire can negatively impact both our communities and our natural resources. So the Living with Wildfire series is designed to help county residents reduce their risk of catastrophic wildfire, learn about the ecological benefits of fire, and become adjusted to living in a fire-adapted region. This series dives into the Bay Area's historic and contemporary fire regimes, explores the sociopolitical contexts that impact our current land and fire management practices, and allows us to hear directly from local professionals and academics about wildfire mitigation activities that we can take on individual, community, and landscape scales. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Daniel Swain about the relationships between weather, climate, and wildfire, and adapting to fire in the face of climate change. Dr. Swain is a climate scientist at the University of California's Agricultural and Natural Resources California Institute for Water Resources, and he's also a research partner at the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research in the Weather Extremes Across Scales section. Before we get started, please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted to CCRCD's YouTube channel. We'll also have a Q&A session following the presentation, so please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom right of your screen, to submit questions during the presentation, and we will answer those at the end. I will also put a feedback form into the chat box, so please feel free to use that to provide feedback for the series or propose topics you'd like to hear at a future webinar. So thank you again for joining, and I'll pass it off to Dr. Swain.
Well, thanks again for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today to talk a little bit about wildfire in a warming California. As you mentioned, my background is in weather and climate, and I've sort of come into a wildfire world from that side of things. Although increasingly, that is also how the modern science of wildfire has come to be viewed as well, is through not only the lens of ecology and land biosphere interactions, but also through the lens of land biosphere atmosphere interactions, because fire ultimately, well, anyway, is a biogeochemical process that connects the land surface with the biosphere with the atmosphere. And as you mentioned, it is also an inherently natural and an inevitable process in many, if not most, ecosystems around the world naturally. But we are also living in an era, both in California and more broadly, where wildfire has become an increasing problem for modern society because of its changing character and our relationship with it. So today I just want to focus on several elements of that in a California specific context. I'll point out some things that are true for certain parts of the state, less true for others, but most of what I'm going to talk about is fairly broadly applicable. So we do know that in California, that we've seen, at least in the last 40 years or so, a large increase in just about every statistic we can possibly attach to wildfire. A large increase in the area burned, a large increase in the losses, economic losses or structural losses from those fires, a large increase in injuries and lives lost, a large increase in resources allocated to managing fire, a large increase in the insurance rates that are associated with insuring against the risk of wildfire. So just about every statistic we've seen has increased. And just since 2015, so over a 10-year period, California has seen 13 of its 20 largest fires in modern record, and the modern record goes back longer, by the way, than just this plot on the right from the 80s goes. Six of which occurred in 2020 alone. 15 of the 20 most destructive fires, which is ultimately maybe one of the more alarming statistics, including five in 2020 and two in 2025. Those were the two fires in LA, the Eaton and the Palisades fires that made the list just last year. And of course, tragically, nine of the 20 deadliest fires, again, two in 2020 and two again just last year in 2025. What this means ultimately is that this sort of has become the natural hazard of the 21st century thus far in California, greatly outpacing deaths and economic harm than from any other kind of natural hazard or disaster. So more people have been directly killed now by California wildfires since 2015 than in all earthquakes in the entire state cumulatively since 1940. So we're getting close to the earthquake death toll over the past century being lower than the wildfire death toll over the past 10 years. And again, this is only direct deaths. Public health officials and people who study the long-term effects, well, both the acute and long-term effects of wildfire smoke and associated pollution suggests that the indirect toll from California wildfires is very likely in the thousands over these years. So this is a major problem, obviously. This has affected hundreds of thousands of Californians directly through either affecting their homes through direct impingement by fire or flame or long-term evacuation from large-scale fires, any number of things. And it's, of course, affecting everyone else through the collective experience, through smoke pollution, and through things like insurance rates. So this is undoubtedly a real issue, and I'm hoping again today to separate wildfire from wildfire disaster because they are not the same thing, but we clearly do have a problem with the impacts of increasingly destructive and harmful wildfires in California in recent years. The other thing I wanted to point out, and you can see this in the chart on the right here, is that while the most active fire years have gotten a lot more active, we see far more acres burned. The quieter years are just about as quiet as they've ever been, and we have had some relatively, comparatively at least, quiet years recently in terms of acres burned. And also, I would add that it does not necessarily take a year with a large acreage burn to be a very harmful or destructive year. Take 2025, for example, which was not all that remarkable in terms of the total area burned, but it ultimately was the most destructive wildfire season on record in California because of the scope of the fires that occurred in a highly populated context in Southern California. So, what's driving this? And there's a few key factors, two of which are not related directly to weather and climate. And the first of these is that we are building more and more neighborhoods, more and more suburbs, more and more subdivisions in the woods or in the grasslands or in the woodlands, whatever the ecosystem type may be, that are in high risk fire zones. So simply, there are more people and more structures in places that we know are prone to wildfires than there ever have been in the past. That alone, even if nothing else had changed, would probably have increased our exposure to the extent that we would be seeing increasing wildfire losses. We also have the legacy of land and forest management, and I do separate these things because we sometimes talk about the fact that we have managed Western coniferous forests in particular in a way that has made them more flammable by excluding natural fire, by removing indigenous and cultural burning largely from the picture over the past century or so, and by favoring densification of some of these Western conifer forests to a level that was much denser than they would naturally have achieved because periodic natural fires would have come and maintained lower tree densities. So essentially, by removing that natural fire in those forests, we have increased the amount of fuel that's there beyond what naturally would have been present and therefore increased fire risk. But of course, not all of the western US is covered in coniferous forests, and that is especially true in places like coastal Southern California or a lot of the Bay Area, including a lot of Contra Costa County, where a lot of what the wildland is in these places is actually either grassland or oak woodland or some other type of forest, less contiguous, many, many thousands of square miles of forest and more of a mixed vegetation type. But here too, in many of these places, we still have a legacy of managing land in a way that has increased risk by removing the higher frequency, for example, of fires in grassland ecosystems that would have occurred in centuries and millennia past that we don't see today to the same degree because we have decided that a lot of those fires are undesirable on the landscape. And the final element here, of course, is our changing climate. And this is really what I'm going to focus on today as a weather and climate scientist. And I just like to emphasize in the beginning that it's not the only factor that matters. If we're going to really tackle the overall problem, we have to be thinking about all of these contributing factors at once. Although in this case, again, I'm going to talk mainly about one of the three. But the other reason why I think it's worth emphasizing the third one here, climate change, is that it is pervasive. So we have climate change on the mountaintops, we have climate change on the beaches, we have climate change in the Central Valley, we have climate change along the North Coast, we have climate change in LA. It's happening everywhere, all around the world, and certainly all around California. And in that sense, it is a more universal actor in terms of upping the ante on wildfire risk than are either of the previous two factors. In specific geographic contexts and for specific fire risk questions, any of these factors can be dominant. In fact, often in some places, it is factors one or two that are the single most important piece. But the thing about climate change is it's relevant everywhere. And for example, forest management is only relevant, well, in forests. And population expansion into high-risk fire zones is only relevant where people actually live. But we're seeing increases in wildfire severity both in highly populated places and in remote places where few, if any, people live. We're seeing increases in wildfire hazard both in forests and in grasslands and in all types of transitional ecosystems. So clearly, it's not just a forest management question either. But climate change is there lurking in the background behind all of this. And we know California is already a warmer place, of course, than it used to be. I update this chart or some version of it every year. This is the most recent update through this past February. And as you can see, we've warmed quite a bit over the past century, but at the rate of warming since about the 1980s, that same period when California wildfire activity has accelerated has been particularly pronounced, with sort of a new plateau, if you will, in record-breaking temperatures since about 2015 or so. And we really haven't dropped back down to temperatures as cool as we had even in the early 2000s since then. We're sort of living in this new abnormal, as some have called it. California's top warmest years on record have all occurred in the past decade, and all of its warmest 15 years have occurred within the past 30. And that's, of course, not something you'd expect to see, except if you had a strong, non-stationary warming trend, which of course is what we have. But the main reason all of this matters for wildfire is actually the indirect effect. It is true that warmer temperatures on their own do predispose potentially flammable environments to burn more readily. That is true. But the more profound effect is actually through the secondary effect of those warming temperatures. Enter the expanding atmospheric sponge effect, as my colleagues and I have called it. So pretty much just visualize, as you see on the screen here now, an ordinary kitchen sponge that becomes progressively larger by about 4% per degree Fahrenheit or 7% per degree Celsius of warming. And as temperatures rise, then the water holding capacity of that figurative sponge increases rapidly. And because it's a percent per degree, that's an exponential increase by definition. So the capacity of the air to hold water vapor rises rapidly directly as a function of warming temperatures, like an expanding sponge. And that might be a little bit more intuitive on the wet side of things. So if you have a much larger and saturated sponge and you wring it out, well, it's going to yield more water. That's analogous to the likelihood of increasingly extreme heavy downpours of rain in a warming climate. But the reverse is also true, where if you have a progressively larger sponge that has not reached saturation, all it retains is its capacity to absorb more and more water vapor. It doesn't actually have the actual water vapor contained within the sponge. And what that means is that a warmer sponge increases the potential both of the intensity of heavy downpours when it's saturated, but it also increases the rate of evaporation when conditions are unsaturated. So it increased the level of atmospheric thirst, the air's propensity to demand water back from the landscape. So it wants to draw more water out of the soil, out of plants, out of bodies of water than ever before. The net result of this is what we call increasing hydroclimate whiplash. But for wildfire, the most important part is likely the fact that in a warmer atmosphere, even if we have about the same amount of precipitation as we used to on average, more and more of that water is re-entering the atmosphere because of this expanding atmospheric sponge. And that leaves less water for plants, and it allows plants to become drier and therefore more flammable during fire season. Accordingly, in California, we actually expect, despite a relatively modest change in average precipitation, to see a large increase in the wettest wet years, also a large increase in the driest dry years, and then subsequently an increase in these swings back and forth between very wet and very dry conditions. We've seen a pretty dramatic example of that just this past year, and if you're in Northern California tomorrow, you might see yet another swing back in the opposite direction. Some unseasonable spring thunderstorms potentially coming back to Northern California following a record-shattering warm and dry March. Um, and what that means not only is that the swings from year to year will be wider, but we also expect to see a stronger seasonality. So we already have, of course, in California, a strongly cyclical seasonality to precipitation. We have wet winters and dry summers with shoulder seasons in the fall and spring that are somewhere in between, somewhere some combination of dry and wet depending on the year. But we expect, on average, that those shoulder seasons will become drier and that the peak winter season may be a bit wetter. And so we see even further accentuation of an already strongly seasonal cycle. This has major implications, of course, for ecosystems and agriculture, but also for wildfire, because it means not only are we likely to experience longer fire seasons, which we've already seen as temperatures have warmed, but also a more intense peak to fire season because we have not only a longer period for vegetation to dry out, especially as we get toward late summer and early autumn, but also, and I'll emphasize this a little bit more in a moment, an increase in the period during which there is overlap between very dry vegetation season in the fall and potentially early winter in some years and strong offshore wind conditions. So those would be the Santa Ana winds from late fall into winter in Southern California, like the ones that drove the fires in 2025, or the Diablo winds of in the Bay Area that we're more familiar with in September and October that have driven a number of other major wildland-fire events that moved into the urban interface in the past several decades, including the Tubbs Fire. It's hard to believe that's going on a decade ago, but the Tubbs Fire about almost a decade ago, and before it, other fires, including the Tunnel Fire, the Oakland Hills Fire back in the early 90s. So we know that drought is increasingly a temperature-driven phenomenon in a warming climate. Of course, we need some level of precipitation deficit, but increasingly the same amount of rain and snow just doesn't go as far as it used to because we're seeing more dry days overall. There's faster evaporation during the dry periods. You can blame the expanding atmospheric sponge for that one, and because we have less snowpack and shorter snow accumulation seasons, which again, we're seeing quite dramatically this year even though Sierra Nevada precipitation this winter is not too far from average. This is not a severe drought year, and yet we have a snowpack that is tied essentially for the worst we've ever seen because of record warmth, and that will probably affect fire season in the Sierra Nevada later this year. One way to think about it is that droughts used to be hot or cold. You could have a precipitation deficit and it could be warmer than average, or you could have a precipitation deficit and it could be colder than average. But at this point in our warming climate, virtually all droughts are now hot droughts because essentially it doesn't really get cold anymore by 20th century historical standards. And all of this matters so much because, again, we can harken back to the dry side of that expanding atmospheric sponge. That's the number one factor driving increasing wildfire severity in a warming climate. We see from many studies at this point that there's a strong relationship between vegetation dryness and vegetation combustion severity. And then in the real world, what that equates to is an increase both in area burned, particularly in forested areas, and in the severity, so the actual thermal intensity or the completeness of that combustion process, that in some cases that relationship is exponential. So it's not just one to one or linear, but in other words, it is highly nonlinear, meaning that each additional increment in the increase in vegetation dryness begets an even larger increment in the increase in area burned or fire intensity. And what we see today is that many regions in the world, but in particular the Western US, are experiencing very profound shifts in the upper statistical portion of the distribution of vegetation dryness. So essentially, we're seeing unprecedented peaks in the intensity and duration of vegetation dryness. Doesn't mean it's drier all the time necessarily, but it does mean that when it is dry, it's drier for longer than ever before. And that's largely a function of what we call the increasing evaporative demand, so the thirstiness of the air itself, directly driven by warming, and that what's known as the increasing vapor pressure deficit, or the VPD, which essentially means the gap between how much water vapor could be in the atmosphere at any given time, which is a function of temperature, and the actual amount of water vapor that is present at any given time is widening. So when it comes to atmospheric water vapor, the gap between the floor and the ceiling, if you will, is expanding over time, and that's essentially extracting more and more moisture that we wouldn't have extracted historically out of soils, out of plants, and that is a key driver in the long-term increase in wildfire area burned. There are other ways of looking at this as well, and when you consider the meteorological factors, so the dryness of vegetation, the temperatures, the ambient atmospheric humidity, and the wind speeds and direction, we find that extreme fire weather conditions have already more than doubled in both northern and southern California during autumn. And there is additional forthcoming work showing that something similar is true in winter, even in coastal Southern California, relevant, of course, to the January 2025 fires that were so destructive there. But it really boils down to this: drier vegetation over a longer, hotter fire season increases a bunch of different characteristics that we don't want to see when it comes to fire. The actual thermal intensity, so literally the temperature of the fire, and therefore its propensity to spread quickly and completely combust vegetation or other things, how quickly the fire propagates across the landscape, so in feet per second or miles per hour, depending on what your preferred unit is. And also, therefore, in the potential destructiveness of fires, because how destructive fires can potentially become is largely a function of how hot they burn and how quickly they spread. They're not always so much a function of the size of the fires, as we've seen with any number of non-record breaking fire sizes that were nonetheless some of the most destructive fires on record. The most dramatic example of this is probably still the Oakland Hills fire from back in the early 90s. That fire had a footprint that would have been spatially quite unremarkable. Certainly in a contemporary context, only a few thousand acres, and yet almost all of those several thousand acres were in populated neighborhoods in the East Bay Hills, and so it was an incredibly destructive event, despite not actually being a very large fire, even by standards of the early 90s. Another reason why all of this matters so much, and I mentioned this earlier, is that relatively modest shifts in fire season. So lengthening fire season, particularly on the quote unquote back end. So think late summer into fall or fall into early winter, especially if you're in Southern California, has an outsized impact because you're not just increasing the number of days per year on which destructive fires can occur. That's true. But more importantly, it means that you're extending fire season longer and longer into what is known as the offshore wind season. Again, so in Northern California, those are the Diablo winds, which occur most often in September or October, or in Southern California, the Santa Ana winds, which are actually a little bit usually occur a little bit later in the year. So from October through as late as January. And the reason why that matters is at the end of fire season, vegetation is close to or just below peak seasonal dryness because we've had the long, dry summer before it. So we can have windy conditions in spring as well, but at least in spring we have the benefit of, in many years, we have grasses, for example, that are still, at least on some north-facing, damper or cooler slopes, Sun-shaded slopes still green. It isn't fully cured. We haven't had the long, dry, usually precipitation-free summer, drying out those heavier forest fuels, so those logs or branches on the forest floor that take weeks to months to fully dry out. They haven't reached their peak seasonal dryness in spring. So while we can see fires in spring and it can be windy in spring, it's a little bit asymmetric. We worry a lot more about the transition season on the back end because that's when we can see the most likely overlap of those really strong winds and, critically, really dry vegetation. So if we increase the length of fire season by, say, 30 days in the fall or early winter, it has an even larger impact than doing so at 30 in the spring. So a 30-day early extension in fire season in the spring still matters, but it's really these fall extensions that I think are what we're most concerned about. And all of this leads to what is, as I mentioned, probably a new, I think this is an old Jerry Brown quote, the former governor of California, but a new abnormal for California wildfire. And I like that term better than new normal for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is that new normal suggests that we've reached some new stable plateau, some semblance of something that will be familiar moving forward. But all signs point to continued rapid change moving forward. And unfortunately, in this context, that does mean further large increases in fire weather conditions in California. How much more? Well, that depends how much we warm, and that is still up in the air. But at least as far as the climate change contribution to wildfire goes, which, as I mentioned, is not the only contributor, it does look like that piece at least is going to get significantly worse than before it gets better. And the reason I emphasize this is not to scare people, but really to point out that because we know this is likely to be true, that really means that our efforts to scale up local to regional scale risk reducing interventions is actually even more urgent than it might otherwise be because we know that this difficult to modify risk factor at larger scales is going to get worse. So we really have to look elsewhere in the short term to see what we can do to offset that, or even in some cases, perhaps reduce, despite the background context of a warming climate, the risk of destructive fires. And, just to zoom out a bit to the big picture, this is not a California specific problem or even a Western US specific problem. In fact, I created this new slide just this week. You're the first audience to see it because I really wanted to add some new data here. These increasingly extreme fire weather conditions are pretty universal phenomenon across the world, with a couple of fairly modest exceptions. So we don't see these increases. We see an observed decrease in fire weather extremes on the Indian subcontinent and parts of far south tropical Asia, and that is about it. Just about everywhere else where there is any trend at all in extreme fire weather, it is a strong increasing one. That's true across Western US, Western Canada, everything from the Amazon rainforest to the tropical rainforests in the Congo to Eastern Australia, much of Eurasia, the Mediterranean, and much of Europe. And the reason for this, the universality of this, is striking because precipitation is not doing the same thing everywhere. There are some places on Earth that are getting wetter in a warming climate, some places that are getting drier, and yet there are very few places that are seeing decreases in extreme fire risk. Why is this? Well, it's mainly because of that expanding atmospheric sponge, which tells us not so much what happens to average precipitation, which can increase or decrease locally. We can't infer it from that alone. But what it does tell us is that the driest dries because of that increasing atmospheric evaporative demand, the thirstiness of that expanding atmospheric sponge is nearly universal. So what it tells us that when it does get dry, it gets drier than ever before. And so even if we don't see high frequency of high fire risk conditions everywhere, we do see that when it does get dry, the fire risk is higher than it used to be. And so there are some places where the average trend is moving in the same direction as the extremes, but virtually everywhere, the highest fire risk days are becoming riskier. And this is even more universal if you look at the actual projected thermal intensity of fire. This is kind of a striking map precisely because it's all red. There's essentially no blue anywhere on it. There's some places where the increase is negligible, but just about everywhere else, the projected increase in the actual intensity of fire is large and substantial, even with a relatively modest amount of warming. So we are approaching, for example, about 1.5 degrees of global mean warming today. And this is a map of the projected increase at 2 degrees of warming, a level that we will very likely exceed by a considerable margin later this century. So this is something that we really do need to be thinking about. It is also worth noting that some of the largest increases in the world, except for, interestingly, the Iberian Peninsula, so places like Spain, are in the Western United States and Western Canada. So we may be in this part of the world, despite there being widespread increases in fire intensity across a wide range of ecosystems, the very largest ones might well occur right around in California and the Western US, plus parts of the Western Mediterranean that have a similar climate to California. And another piece of this too is that it isn't just the average dryness that matters. Also important is the temporal sequence of events, and I'll dig into that a little bit. Consider the example again of the fires last year in January 2025 in Los Angeles. We actually had two exceptionally wet years, believe it or not, that immediately led up to those fires. In fact, in some parts of LA County, we had the second wettest 2 year period on record immediately preceding the fires. But then, that summer, 2024, we had the warmest summer on record across the mountains of Southern California. It wasn't extremely hot in LA proper, but the summer was warmer than average, certainly in LA County on average. But then the real kicker was the extreme heat and then the record-breaking dryness that occurred from September onward. Into January, we actually had the driest 6 month period on record in the same region in Los Angeles. So we literally went from second wettest 2 year period on record to single driest 6 month period on record, plus unusual warmth, an unusually expanded atmospheric sponge. We went from extreme vegetation accumulation in grassland environments and in was the chaparral environment, which is what the woody shrubs that predominate a lot of the coastal Southern California hills are called. We had abundant growth of herbaceous vegetation following this really wet period, and then we kiln dried it essentially with a record dry period immediately thereafter. The vegetation desiccation. So in this vegetation accumulation to desiccation cycle, we then followed it up with the strongest Santa Ana wind event in about 10 years, and we know what happened next under those extremely critical fire weather conditions in Southern California. Remarkably, though, and I added this back in, and I realized that this is hidden, we actually just went right back to record wet conditions this past fall. Once again, in coastal Southern California, where October through December 2025 was literally the wettest October through December period in coastal Southern California in over a century. So this has been a remarkable period of whiplash that in part helped facilitate the firestorms we saw. And the reason for this actually does start to make a little bit of intuitive sense if you dig a little bit more deeply. Because what we see in general is this pattern of fuel accumulation to desiccation cycles, particularly in grasslands, but also in shrublands as well, where essentially environments where you have what are known as fuel limited fire regimes, where some years there's less growth of vegetation, other years there's more growth. And so sometimes, historically, the most active fire periods would follow the wetter periods. But in a warming climate, things are shifting because now it's still true that we get more vegetation growth following the wet periods, but now we can supercharge the fire risk that follows because we now have extremely warm and or dry conditions that are likely to follow whatever very wet periods we have. That's a signature of increasing hydroclimate whiplash. Now, it is true that in forests, in sort of your traditional conifer forest, the sort of the what you might imagine when you think about a wildfire in some parts of the country, it is true that the most adverse fire conditions usually do follow dryness. So in forests, usually the rule of thumb is the drier, the more flammable. But in grasslands, it's the more abundant, the more flammable. And so you can see how in a warming climate, which is characterized both by drier, dry extremes on the one hand, but also greater swings between wet and dry on the other, all while it gets warmer, we actually see an increasing recipe for more wildfires in both types of ecosystems, but they might not always occur at the same time or in the same year. So we might actually have a shifted peak where the worst years for forest fire risk are not always the worst years for grass and brush fire risk. And there's actually now some specific evidence that this is true in California ecosystems. In fact, we see that when we look at fire intensity over the last 20 years, we see this strong signal where there are variations in moisture levels, specifically cascades between very wet conditions to very dry conditions, are immediately what precede in these fuel limited fire regimes, including grasslands and shrublands, the most active fire years. And this period can occur as much as 6 to 24 months before the active period. So, depending on your ecosystem, this is a process that gets set into motion as much as 1 to 2 years in advance. And again, it's all linked to that fuel accumulation, then desiccation cycle in non-forested ecosystems. And in Southern California, we already see that in winter there has been a large increase, around a 40% increase in the severity of wintertime or peak Santa Ana wind season overlapping extreme fire weather conditions since the 1980s. And again, that's really not that long a period of time to see such a large increase. And I do want to just emphasize sort of what this looked like on the ground. This is just some image. You know, this is definitely a sort of a worst case scenario, but again, it's a real one. This isn't a hypothetical. This is doorbell camera footage from the Eaton fire showing the nature of the ember storm that resulted in this blizzard of embers during this firestorm last year. And I bring this up because it is remarkable footage. You can see these walls of these sheets of millions, if not billions, of embers just flying down the street and accumulating at any of these pinch points. So along people's wooden fences, on their lawns, even, or brush in the front yard, and the palm trees you can start to see in the background are going up in flames. The reason I really emphasize this is just to illustrate what the reality is in the wildland urban interface or the intermix during a worst case scenario fire weather event. Because these extreme events are just as much an extreme weather event as they are a wildfire. In fact, some of my wildland fire and severe weather colleagues have likened some of the worst, most destructive urban firestorms in recent winters, or actually, I should say, in recent years, to essentially a windstorm with fire embedded in it. That is a pretty apt description when you see footage like this, and you can see just sort of what it looks like on the ground at the very worst moments. And also, when we talk about home hardening and all the kinds of interventions we can do with respect to zone zero, and we talk about ember resistant vents and defensible space, and thinking about what vegetation is or isn't right up against the house, and wooden fences and wooden decks and all of that, this is exactly why. This is the kind of footage where that becomes really apparent why those kinds of mitigations are important. Less for when there's just a singular wall of flames, because the good and the bad news is that's usually not how this happens, but when there is the ember storm like we see here. So that's one visual lesson from LA, but there's a few others, I think. And, one is that we know this was an extreme event, but we also know that these were neighborhoods, unfortunately, that were known to be in the fire world at very high risk. And yet, there's very little recent fire experience, or at least significant fire experience, in these very same neighborhoods. And the number of people I've spoken to who were in these neighborhoods, many of whom lost their homes in this disaster, told me that they were very surprised that their neighborhoods could be devastated by a wildfire, which I continue to find perhaps a failure of communication of local officials. Because in the wild and fire world, these were considered to be some of the highest risk corridors in the LA region. There are others that are at similarly high risk, but these were pretty high on the list. And yet a lot of folks believed that they were so far from the brush or so far from the forest that they didn't have to worry about it. But fire science and meteorology really had told us a different story. And other lessons too, I think, and we've seen this with other California wildfires as well, that under sufficiently extreme weather and climate conditions, there are real limits on what firefighting can achieve. When the winds are sufficiently strong, you can't conduct aerial firefighting. Water drops from helicopters or retardant drops from fixed wing aircraft are essentially impossible because you'd be endangering the lives of the pilots and then also of people on the ground. Aircraft simply can't operate safely or effectively under those conditions. The other reality that we've seen with Northern California fires as well, beginning really with the Great Quake of 1906, which of course was not a wildfire, but the city of San Francisco largely burned in its aftermath, is that urban water supplies are not designed to fight thousands of simultaneous structure fires. We have very few water systems in the world that would be capable of doing so, even in the wealthiest, most modern cities. Interestingly, one of the only cities that might be able to do this is San Francisco, and it is partly because of the lessons learned during the 1906 quake that there is essentially a secondary, fully redundant fire flow system that can connect even to bay water in an emergency. But almost no other urban areas, even in the Bay Area or California, have a similar secondary backup. And once you start getting fires on this scale, as they say, the math simply doesn't math. The physics don't work, the fluid flow volumetrically, the number of leaks, the amount of water you need to push through the system all at once. We just haven't built urban water systems to do that. So there's some questions as to whether maybe we should be reconsidering this, but as of today, this isn't really something that we have at our disposal. Another lesson is that these so-called spot fires, these small little uh, fires that are sometimes, most fires start as a spot fire, something you could step over, just a foot or two in diameter, but under these extreme conditions, they can become uncontrollable, as you saw from that footage, literally within seconds. And so sometimes the notion that if only we had more fire crews, if only we had firefighting drones, well, the reality is you have in some cases just seconds before those no longer would be useful interventions. And what it really emphasizes too is the critical importance of vegetation management, not just in the wildland, not just in parks, but even in neighborhoods, in your backyard, in roadway medians, in city parks, and places like that. That's just as important, if not more so, even in some cases, in the vegetation in what we might consider to be the wildland environment. There were some near misses in Southern California, so I'm actually grateful that the outcome wasn't worse in terms of the human toll because there were a few of these near misses, and while things have gotten better in terms of emergency communication relative to what they were 10 or 15 years ago, if anybody lived through the North Bay fires or the Oakland Hills fire back in the 90s, we still have work to do. And when minutes matter, we need to still do better than we are today. And I'm gonna skip through this a little bit just because I want to leave some time for questions. But I just want to emphasize a couple of things about ordinary versus extraordinary fire risk. And that is that the risk of catastrophic wildfires under extraordinary conditions, which can include some combination of historic heat or drought or extreme wind, are not necessarily the same places that are most at risk under ordinary conditions. And I wanted to sort of pose this question in the context of the Bay Area, which is where in California and the Bay Area might some underappreciated risk hotspots lurk? And I think the answer to this can be found in some portions of the new updated CAL FIRE uh, hazard severity mapping that came out, I think it was last year. And this was somewhat controversial at the time, but I actually think that CAL FIRE did a pretty good job with it because a lot of what people find controversial is precisely this perceptual mismatch between the risks of the places that are at risk of frequent fire versus the risks that are under the places that are under the risk of at least occasional risk of extraordinary fire. And in California, this is going to be places like the Highway 1 corridor, so the Pacific Coast Highway, where most of the time it's damp, it's foggy, there's negligible risk of a fire you'd really have to be very concerned about. But under extreme conditions, say a severe drought, a major autumn heat wave, and then a strong Diablo wind event with winds of 30, 40 miles an hour, gusting to 50 or 60 miles an hour. That does happen in those locations. And if a fire were to ignite upwind of Half Moon Bay or one of these coastal communities near Santa Cruz, between Santa Cruz and Pacifica, for example, these are places that are infamous for being chilly, foggy, and not flammable. But on precisely those conditions, these are communities that would actually be at very high risk of a wild and urban interface disaster. And that is precisely what I mean by the divergence between ordinary and so-called extraordinary risk. So I always like to end with this kind of slide because I think it really emphasizes what we're dealing with. I've had, unfortunately, the occasion to add a new panel to this rather disconcerting series of images, but wildfire itself is not the problem. Wildfire is not inherently bad. It's a natural process, a necessary process ecologically in many settings, but it's the intersection with populated areas and the increase in disasters that has become the problem. And so I think our burning question is not even can we decouple fire from catastrophe, because I think the science and the recent evidence shows that we physically can do it. The question is whether we will actually achieve that. And again, it's something that can be done, but I think it's a matter of will, and it's a matter of whether we make smart decisions, within our own communities about reducing risks and planning for the inevitable, because we can really bring about outcomes that are much improved relative to what we would see otherwise. And I will skip through this in the interest of getting to questions in from today's talk, but just to sort of sum up the key points here. In California, we already have an evolving relationship with wildfire as temperatures warm, and part of this is the direct effect of warming temperatures, and the immediately secondary effect of that expanding atmospheric sponge through the effect of a thirstier atmosphere, rising evaporative demand, and subsequently longer fire seasons, increasing peak vegetation dryness, and also, at least in grassland and brushy settings, that increase in hydroclimate whiplash also supercharging that vegetation growth then desiccation type cycle. But it's also important to recognize that climate change, while it is undoubtedly an increasingly important driver, is never going to be the sole culprit of skyrocketing wildfire losses or even of the physical increase in fire intensity. There are multiple factors at play. And the reason why I think that's so important to emphasize, even as a climate scientist who works extensively in the wildfire world, is to really just hammer home the point that there is no singular silver bullet solution. We can't only address the urban expansion component or the land management component or the forest management component or the climate change component and expect to solve the problem, because it really truly is all of these things operating all at once. And so to address all of these converging causes, really to meet the challenge, we gotta figure out how to address this from all of those relevant angles at once if we really want to move the needle. So with that, I think I'll thank everybody for their attention and just emphasize that if you're so inclined, University of California does have a survey on my weather and climate communication activities that if you have 3 or 4 minutes, I'd appreciate if you'd fill out. That's accessible via the QR code in the link on the screen, which I'll leave up for a few minutes so people who want to take a look can find it. And you can also find me all across the internet according to the various social media handles, emails, and websites on the left. So with that, I'll leave it there, and hopefully we still have at least 10 minutes or so for some questions.
Thanks, Dr. Swain. That was an awesome presentation. Yeah, I'll give it a few minutes for folks to put their questions in the Q&A box. Um, Hopefully that is working all right. And then, yeah, the RCD also has a feedback form if anyone's interested in filling that out. That helps us kind of make the webinars better as we go forward. And then also, if you have any questions for Dr. Swain that maybe you don't want to ask on the webinar, you can feel free to submit that through the feedback form as well. Um, Okay. So actually, I was kind of curious. I know you skipped over the slide in the presentation, but I did see something about prescribed fire in there. And I was just
Yeah,
curious, maybe if you do want to give like a quick rundown of what you were going to say about that.
yeah. I'll reshare screen so I can show that. All right, so I think you're seeing it full screen again. So
Yes.
we do so just to quickly review for everybody, prescribed fire has a lot of ecological and risk reduction benefits. So in some cases, it can help reintroduce fire onto landscapes where there is a modern fire deficit relative to what natural fire and indigenous and cultural burning would have brought to specific places in centuries past. Um, And it also can, even in places where there's not necessarily the same deficit of historical fire, bring risk reduction benefits because of the fact that it can allow for um, landscapes that have less fuel on them and give you more opportunities to manage that landscape for ecological health and fire risk reduction. Um, Most of that prescribed burning is going to occur under what we call Goldilocks sets of conditions. So you might imagine you probably can't do a successful prescribed burn if it's pouring rain or snowing because it's too damp. You aren't going to get adequate combustion. You aren't going to achieve your goals. On the other hand, you probably don't want to do so on an incredibly windy day during a heat wave, during a historic drought for safety reasons because there's a risk that that fire could do something you don't want it to do and become an unwanted wildfire. So it's that Goldilocks. The specific definitions vary considerably depending on the ecosystem type and the location, but it's sort of this Goldilocks window in some form. And what we find in our own work is that we will, unfortunately, probably see a significant decrease in the total number of days annually that are favorable for prescribed fire across most of California and really most of the West. But there's a really big caveat, which is that we will still have far more prescribed days meteorologically favorable for prescribed fire, even in a much warmer climate, than we currently use today. So even if we lost half of those days per year when the atmosphere was cooperating for prescribed fire, we could probably still double the number of days of prescribed fire we actually implement because we're doing not enough of it to begin with. So that's one piece. And the other interesting piece here is that we do, in fact, see, at least in Northern and Central California, and that does include the Bay Area, in winter, there might actually be a significant increase in the number of days that we can perform safe and effective prescribed fire. Even if we lose days in pretty much all other seasons, that this winter would be a good example of that because despite record heat and dryness in March, we're not experiencing a severe drought. There were some golden opportunities for prescribed fire at times in Northern California this winter, despite the weird record warm conditions at times. So I think this winter is a nice anecdote that kind of illustrates what those kinds of seasonal shifts might look like. So one big question is whether we can pivot more to that year-round or shift in the seasonal of the burning cycle.
Cool. Thank you for that explanation. And then, yeah, looks like we have a question from an audience member. So they're asking, what, if any, key messages have you seen that motivate residents to embrace the new abnormal and take action?
Well, I mean, I think that unfortunately, there's now so many Californians who have direct personal experience with wildfire in some form, whether it's wildfire that got close to their house or burned their neighbor's house or just was in the same city or, they experienced the smoke or evacuations. I don't think this is I think correctly, most Californians don't view this as a theoretical risk. It's correctly acknowledged as being a here and now, something that could affect me, even if I don't necessarily live out in the woods somewhere. Um, so I think that part of the buy-in process was more difficult 15 or 20 years ago. That part is easier now. I think most people, it's a fairly easy sell, if you will. But then what to do about it specifically? I do really like to emphasize the fact that when it comes to wildfire, a lot of the local interventions, some of the local interventions are literally at the scale of your home individually that can be really effective. And that is not always true of other hazards. It's fairly difficult for you, the individual, to meaningfully change the flood risk, for example, that your home experiences, or if you live in hurricane country, the risk of hurricanes or sea level rise or whatever the case may be. But when the case of wildfire, what you do at, structure by structure can be really important and can completely change the outcome of a structure burning or not in a wildfire. And we see that this is pretty strongly evidenced in cases where really destructive wildfires have burned through small pockets of homes and structures that were fire hardened or were built to much more fire resilient building codes. And in most cases, the majority of those structures survive even when the entirety of the neighborhood surrounding them burns. And of course, that's not a great outcome in itself because it still means much of the neighborhood burned. But it does sort of illustrate proof of concept, which is that, even in the context of a pretty fiery, event where you have embers blowing down the street and you have adjacent structures on fire, thinking carefully about what those structures are built from, how they're built, what the vegetation is, and how it's managed near those structures can be kind of the determinative outcome. And so I think what's compelling is that incremental steps are valuable. Putting the Zumba resistant vents on your structure, as a first step, that's pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of cost, in terms of effort, and yet there's a decent chance that under some conditions it could prevent your house from burning down. And you go down the list of things, you talk about zone zero, you talk about wooden fences and wooden decking and roofs and trimming some of the branches. And it's not a case of get rid of all the trees or nobody can have plants anymore, of course. That's not what anybody's arguing. It's a question about being smart about these things, where relatively modest shifts can actually make a pretty large effect on the risk at the individual structure level. And then that's kind of a positive feedback in a sense, both in the scientific self-reinforcing sense and in the colloquial sense, which is that the interventions that you do benefit your neighbors, and the more people in a given neighborhood that or a given community that make these interventions, the larger the net benefit actually is. It's not linear, but it's kind of multiplicative because one structure fire hardened is helpful, but then having a whole line of them or a whole neighborhood of them makes that whole neighborhood much more impervious. So I think that if the more we look, the evidence of success is somewhat self-evident. It isn't absolute, but it's pretty clear that there's a lot that can be done pretty quickly in terms of fire resilience from a structure perspective. And then, we see that emergency communications, I mean, they've certainly improved since a decade ago, during these events. They also certainly aren't perfect, but if you think back to how the sort of the fog of war type situations we saw with events in the 2010s, even, for example, um, we're doing a lot better than that today. And so I know it can be tough to sometimes see the progress because we're still seeing really catastrophic wildfire disasters. And yet there is progress embedded in that. And the lessons, if we extrapolate them and apply them more widely, I think we could really see um, real acceleration of that progress too.
Cool. Thank you. Um, all right, I think we have time for like one more question. So we have a question that is, what are your thoughts on how cities can utilize grazing to reduce fire risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, a one tool in the toolbox, and I think I've been seeing a lot more goats on hillsides lately. And in some places where you have like cattle grazing strategically, I see that in some areas too. But sometimes it's easier said than done. But again, it's kind of an all of the above approach. And the nice thing about bringing in goats or some species to do some sort of targeted grazing is that it's a sort of a reasonably nature-based solution that doesn't involve it presents fewer, in some cases it can be tricky to do prescribed burning right in the middle of neighborhoods and these small patches of dense brush, for example, in between structures. It can be harder to both for perceived risk and in some cases actual risk. It's a great sort of intervention in those kinds of settings where it's relatively small in scope, but the benefits are pretty big. It may be just an acre of a hillside, but if it were to go up in a fire, it could immediately threaten a bunch of people's homes, and it might be a difficult place to go in there and get heavy equipment in there for vegetation management or for prescribed fire for safety reasons. And so bring in the goats, I guess, and they can scale the hillside and do some good work there. And I just would emphasize that any intervention, any of these interventions, really, in terms of vegetation, whether it's prescribed fire or grazing or other kinds of more direct interventions, you have to maintain them, and they don't magically protect you forever. You can't just go in once, one treatment, and then call it done for 50 years. This is an ongoing process, and often it's that initial entry that's the most difficult. It's easier to maintain fuel management projects once you do that first work than it is to that initial entry. But we do, periodically have to revisit this. It isn't a one and done kind of thing. So I'm all for goats, but I think that in general, it's most helpful in some of these edge cases where it's really helpful, but it's not, I don't think it's not so much a solution across hundreds of thousands of acres, but on those, slopes within cities and suburbs, it can be a great adjunct to other kinds of projects.
Definitely. Cool. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so seeing that we're just past 4, I think it's time that we close out this webinar. So I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Swain, for your time and for your presentation. And thanks to the audience members for tuning in and supporting the webinar series. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.